pleasure and an honor for me to introduce this evening's lecturer. For those of us that go to waiting rooms and read Reader's Digest, they have, I think, a series that's called The Most Unforgettable Characters I've Ever Met. And it's a pleasure this evening for me to introduce one of those, at least in my life, and that's David Lewis. It's been my privilege to know David since 1980. He's South African and left South Africa in 1944. I take it persona non grata. And he went to England and actually spent a great deal of time as a writer, as somebody doing a lot of writing about art, and didn't enter architecture school until he was 36 years old. So for those of you that are looking at a number of years here with us, there's much hope. And he studied architecture at Leeds and then practiced in London and in England. And in 1963, he was invited to the United States by, at that time, Carnegie Institute of Technology as the Andrew Mellon Professor of Urban Design. And I believe that was the first distinguished chair to be actually devoted to the teaching of urban design in this country. He soon thereafter, in 1964, founded UDA Architects or Urban Design Associates, a firm that specializes in urban design and in contextual architecture and planning. David is no stranger to Indiana or to Muncie. He's been involved in a number of projects in Indianapolis, including the Martin Luther King Park, some of the work done for the early Model Cities program in the very late 60s, and in fact was one of the designers for the original concept for the PUI campus. I met David for a very enjoyable 4 days on the 22nd floor of the Hyatt Regency Hotel when he chaired the 10-member PDAT charrette team, which basically came to Indianapolis to look at the issues and the potentials of the White River Park in Indianapolis. And since that time, of course, that has come to fruition. David was a member, a very important member of, we think, a very unique charrette, which we will talk about a little bit later, of Muncie Charrette 82, which brought faculty and students from 11 different universities, planning, landscape architecture, and architecture students and faculty, and 6 practitioners, one of whom was David. David and I and Hari and Michelle spent a very enjoyable 3 days just about a year ago in Madison, Indiana, floating down the Ohio River on one of our small town charrettes, in which David was an invited guest to join the Ball State team. And that's the first time that David and I ever closed down a Baskin-Robbins. Now, David has closed down many a pub, but it was the first time we ever closed down a Baskin-Robbins together on their main street. I think the most exciting thing for those of us who call Muncie home is the fact that David's firm, UDA Architects, and the Muncie firm of Rundell, Ernstberger and Associates have just been named as the planners, landscape architects, and urban designers for the Muncie Downtown Revitalization Plan, and we'll begin work shortly on that. So David will be a frequent visitor here to Middletown, USA. Without any further ado, I give you David Lewis.
Do I have to put this around my neck?
Yeah, it works better, and then you're not encumbered by it. Let's see. Okay, I think marvelous.
Oh yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Once, I was. Is that working? Introduced, not quite so eloquently, but in a similar manner, by an octogenarian engineer in Cleveland, and he completed his peroration with, "And now I introduce to you one of the world's most famous architects, Mr. Davis Lude." And then he didn't know why everybody was laughing. He thought that was wonderful sort of introduction. I don't know what I'm going to talk about tonight. I haven't prepared anything very much. But while you were introducing me, I was really reminded of the great engineer, Felix Samueli, who came to talk to us when we were students. He was a great engineer. I don't know whether any of you have ever heard of him here in the States. He was a Jewish refugee from the Nazis, and we were very fortunate to have him in Britain. He was such a revered figure that we dressed in our white architectural smocks and marched him up from the railway station to the School of Architecture bearing our T-squares to his lecture. And he stood before us. I will never forget it. This great man, very small, very humble man, very shy, didn't quite know what to say. Looking around himself, he seemed to perceive a little bit of dandruff. And he said, this great engineer, he said, why don't we talk about structures? I feel like that. Why don't we talk about urban design? And then he produced from his pocket a grass, a weed on a stem. And he said, on the way up, I picked a weed. And then he began to describe the column of the weed and the stem and the grass blade and the triangulation. And the next thing was we were off into the cantilevers, the turning moments, and all the rest of it, the grass blade. And we did these marvelous formulae in that lecture. And we did the truss. And we did Young's modulus of elasticity. And then he fumbled again, and he brought out a little bottle with a little water in it and a little syringe. And he took his grass blade and he put a little drop of dew on it. The water ran down to the edge where it stopped. And there was this little drop on it. Then we began some more calculations, more turning moments. And then finally we did a calculation for the skin of the drop, because what stopped the drop from actually falling off? And we did that. And then the next time he came, it was the turn of a tomato. He'd gone through the town and he'd picked up a tomato. I learned a great deal, not just about structures, from this wonderful man who had such a poetic vision about the wholeness of things. But I learned a lot, too, oddly enough, about urban design. Because it's not in the grandiloquent Beaux-Arts schemes that urban design is at its most valuable and at its most telling. It's at the level of ordinary people in ordinary streets, in ordinary towns, because that's 99% of urban America, and it's 99% of where we live. It's interesting to me and an honor to me to be in Middletown, USA, because Middletown is exactly what it means. It is not just the geographical middle. It's nothing to do with that. It's to do with somehow being the norm, being that part of America from which everything flows, both up and down. It's where middle people are. It's where life is at its median. I was asked for a title for my talk tonight, and the first title that I gave is really in many ways the same as the second. The first title came from a quote from an 18th century bishop called Jean-Pierre Fournier, a French bishop. He said, there are three fine arts: painting, sculpture, and ornamental pastry making, of which architecture is a branch. And I thought that it would be nice to talk about the art of pastry making, because in many ways, when you really think about it, what he had to say was true. There's no secret to pastry making, but ornamental pastry making. And to see, as we will do in this talk, that the basic elements of American urbanism are very simple and very straightforward. But it's the characterization of urbanism that gives it its special character and its special flavor. Once we grasp that, we're home and dry. And we'll begin to talk about that in a moment. But Tony felt that pastry making was perhaps a little bit frivolous. So we went to a much more serious title called Kiss My Grids. Because we felt that we really wanted to pay honor to the American grid. We wanted to lavish affection on it, and therefore what better way of expressing our affection for it than kissing it? So we borrowed the phrase from what was her name, Flossie or Flo or whatever her name was, who was in the restaurant of Mel's Diner, and we decided that we would kiss our grids. May I take my jacket off? What I want to do tonight is just go through some slides, unfold a picture story to you, to try to describe to you in a short fashion why the American grid is so important, what it means, why we've tended in the past to overlook it, why it's had such curious and bitter opponents, including, oddly enough, Louis Mumford. And yet why it's essential for us to build on it and to use it. So what I'm going to do is to ask you to turn down the lights. And those of you who are bored are perfectly welcome to go to sleep as long as you don't snore too loudly, because that's embarrassing for the lecturer, you know, if the room is filled with snores. Now, I'm supposed to work these things, aren't I? There we go. Now, this extraordinary beast that you're looking at here is not the skin of an armadillo. It's actually the map of London, or the map of London as it was at just about the peaking of the Georgian period. Those of you who know London at all will know that at the time of the Great Fire of London in 1666, there were essentially two cities. There was the city, the commercial city of London, which was, oddly enough, called the City of London. And then there was the royal city, which was where the Palace of Westminster was, and Westminster Abbey, where the king lived. And in between, there was a connecting road that ran along the river bank, along the bank of the River Thames, and it was called the Strand. And that's a road that I'm sure that many of you have traveled on when you visit London. It's now in the heart of London, but in those days, it was along the river bank in open country. After the fire, Great Fire of London, Christopher Wren and John Evelyn and others drew plans for the rebuilding of London, which were based on what one might call the reign of reason. They were geometric plans. For the most part, they were grids. It seemed a very sensible and rational way of urban planning. But of course, to impose the grid on the medieval city was impossible, because although the medieval city had burnt down, what had not burnt down were two things. First of all, the property rights of individual owners were not burnt down. They had rights, properties that they owned. And the government had no, what we call eminent domain, no right of compulsory purchase. Secondly, but most importantly, the owners had within their own minds, a metaphor of their city, an image. It was an image based on tradition. So they built the medieval city back on the old medieval roadbeds and on the old infrastructures. Now that's an important lesson there, because when you look at most of our old cities, where you look at my city, Pittsburgh, the grid of downtown was laid out as a grid of streets before the first houses were built. And that grid remains exactly the same to this day, with the modern skyscraper city growing out of the original infrastructure of streets. But in the countryside between Westminster and the City of London, which was owned by the noble lords, particularly the Duke of Devonshire, the Earl of Southampton, it was possible there to develop a rational method of development. And gradually, this area was developed by the lords themselves as real estate, so that Georgian London grew up as a grid, as you can see to the left of the slide, as a grid of blocks and squares. I'm only raising this matter because the early settlers of the United States were, of course, from England. And they brought with them certain images, certain traditions of the way in which towns and communities should be laid out. It's important to see Georgian London a little bit before we go into the big differences that we will perceive in the United States development of this tradition. The streets of Georgian London, the blocks, were essentially conceived as one building. Each block was one building. Generally, it was built by a developer. The great developers of Georgian London, Nicholas Barban to begin with, and then the Cubitt brothers and Barton. These people developed whole blocks under leasehold. The earls and noble lords who owned the land didn't sell the land. They, under contract with the developers, allowed the developers to develop leasehold. And you seldom see in London, in fact, if you see a for sale sign that says freehold, that is very rare. That means that you can own the land. By and large, most of Georgian London, to this day, is still leasehold. And what you can see is the idea of a single building with the individual ownership or occupancy of the units is suppressed. The individuality is suppressed. It's the unity of the whole that governs the Georgian concept of the building. And in fact, in Nash's buildings and the buildings of the Wood brothers, they tried to imitate great palaces on the block. There would be a very ornate building at each end with pilasters and entablatures and a very ornate center designed perhaps rather like the front of a Rolls Royce in the middle, and then there would be the infill pieces to look like a great palace. And the developers would even insist from the noble lords that they would sell those end pieces. They would guarantee to have noble lords or titled gentry occupy the wings and the center, because that would guarantee for them the sales in between. It's as though a developer would ask you to guarantee that you would have Henry Ford at one end and you would have Rockefeller at the other, and in the middle you would have, who should we say, Rocky or a film star or whatever in the middle, and that would, everybody would then flock to occupy the infill ones. So that the individuality of the individual units was suppressed. Now we look at America. This is one of the earlier settlements. This is Edgartown in Massachusetts. The layout of this is rather like an English village. It's hardly surprising, since the early immigrants came from rural areas. But there's a basic difference. The basic difference is that as you can perhaps see if you look at the slide carefully, that actually the layout of this settlement is on individual pieces of land, that every householder has property, and that every house is separate on that land. It's not a continuous building, it's discontinuous. Everybody is separate. Every house is a different shape and a different form at the choice of the property owner and the building owner. And in fact, the concept was that the concept of citizenship was that people who paid property taxes were citizens. And it's a very important basic concept, because it means that if you're a property owner and you're paying taxes on property, you have an equity stake in the public, because of the tradition already set up in New England for individual ownership and the payment of property taxes as the key to citizenship, but also because of the fire of London. He didn't want, if a building burnt, he didn't want the flames to leap from one building to another, and therefore they were separated by airspace. And he ordained that the architecture should, if possible, be brick. So that although these townhouses are in Boston, townhouses of this kind, belonging so solidly to the English tradition, are really an anachronism in the American tradition, because we do like the idea of the individual expression of our buildings. We like doing what we want to do and what we care to do on our individual properties. Now, going back, if I may, just a moment, I'd like to go back again to the William Penn plan. What William Penn did was to devise a plan that had equivalent block sizes, and within the equivalent block sizes was a subdivision into lots. And so that everybody would start off with an equivalent lot size. And on that lot, they would build their house. And the house would be a body language of who they were. To begin with, the houses tended to be very similar to one another because it was very early on. But the principle remains the same, that you have a unified armature. You have a unified grid, a grid of holism, a grid of equivalence, in which every citizen is, in fact, has equal rights, is, in fact, equivalent. And that, at the same time, what he does with his property is a body language of himself within the framework of equivalence. And the democracy is based on the idea of having an equity stake in the public interest of the community. Absolutely critical. And so we would find in the grid town that, and Muncie is the same as hundreds of other towns, you can find this all over the place, that the property lines are equivalent still. The block sizes are equivalent, but the buildings on those lot sizes vary according to the body language of the owner. Now here is an owner who wants to display opulence, a romantic mood, a fair amount of literacy. He starts off with a basic plan, and then he adds things. You add a dormer to it. You add a mansard to it. You add a tower to it. You add brackets to it. You add all these things to it. You get a pattern book. Pattern books were sold in shops. Even Sears Roebuck sold them, and Montgomery Ward sold them. And you could buy these pattern books. And this probably came from the pattern book of a man called Downing, who produced these wild extravagances. And they caught on because people wanted to express their own individuality, their own body language of who they were in relationship to the whole. And wherever you go in these towns, you find these expressions on properties which are equivalent and which face the land, face the street in according to building lines, and march up and down the street. Jefferson was particularly hot on this idea and built it into a notion of democracy called the Jeffersonian principle. And it governs us to a very large extent to this day. Jefferson believed deeply that everybody should have property. Everybody should own. He was, in a sense, anti-city. He was suspicious of renters because he felt that people who didn't own property did not have an equity stake in the community and therefore were more prone to become criminals than if they did have a stake. He saw crime directly related to not having roots in the soil. And so when the Congress of 1778, the First Continental Congress, decreed the idea of dividing the continent geometrically by grids, they had two things in mind. One was to sell the land because the Congress needed money. It was bankrupt. It desperately needed funds. But the other was the Jeffersonian principle, to get people to own property. And although there were large speculative companies, they tried, the government genuinely tried, to only sell land to those companies that were composed of shareholders who would become property owners. And they tried very hard to hold out-and-out speculators at bay. And the idea was, and you can, flying across the United States, you can see the result of it, was to divide the continent into squares of 1 mile by 1 mile, and every so often to have a town. And the town itself would be subdivisions of the grid into blocks, and blocks into lots as a rational way of interrelating every dwelling, whether rural or urban, into a single matrix of equivalence. Equivalence of opportunity and the right of citizenship in a democratic form. And so the grid goes across the country until, as you can see in the bottom of the slide, it collides with the Rocky Mountains. And as we look down across the grid, we can see our farm buildings. And the farm buildings are painted white, just as they were in Edgartown and in New England, are painted white, that they form themselves a mini-grid within the grid, that they very often are based on a small urban square, not always, but a small urban square in the middle, around which are grouped buildings that have a different language, a different architectural language, but are part of a geometrical whole. And even the occasional building way out in the countryside also responds as much to the grid as the urban buildings, and we even bury our dead in grids. And as the grid will leap across man-made or natural barriers and then continue on the other side. Here we see a grid that is bisected diagonally by a railway line. And it just crosses the railway line and continues on the other side, as though, in a sense, the railway line doesn't exist. It does the same thing with hills. If you look at a map of San Francisco, it's a grid. And that gives you the wonderful terraces that look over the ocean. If you look at Seattle, it's a grid. And it's laid out as a grid because of property values and the disposal of property. It's not laid out as a grid because it's responding to the form of the land. It's quite the reverse. It doesn't respond to the form of the land. Here's a little piece of Long Island. I mean, amazing, really. It's as though it was a graph paper, tall, along the edges. There's the grid. And it runs to the beach on each side, as though the ocean doesn't exist. There's no recognition of the ocean. Here are some things from my city, Pittsburgh, which, as you know, is a city of extreme topographies. To look at the map, that's the first thing I get our students to do, is to map the grids and to map the topography separately and then impose them one over the other. It's fascinating. This is an early plat of Columbus. Of course, the grid leaps the river and continues on the other side. You can see the reservation for the courthouse in the middle. And we have innumerable examples of this. The reservation for the courthouse is simply a block pulled out, like a plug pulled out of the middle, and the courthouse inserted. Early map of Indianapolis. And here we see Hartford, Indiana, with the courthouse in the block in the middle. And we can see that it's surrounded, of course, by commercial buildings, which in turn give way to the residential blocks. The plat is exactly the same. It's equivalent throughout. Madison, Indiana, the town where I was privileged enough to join your Bald Stage Charrette. It opens like a fan as it responds, the grid responds to the riverfront. One of the few grids that I know that turns like that. And here is a figure ground that we did during that charrette of the town. And you can see the town becomes denser, more, as most towns do, in the middle, but without breaking the grid. And if you look here into a town in New Hampshire, you can see how every individual building occupies an exactly equivalent lot within the block, but has a different expression. And it's this different expression, this endless variety of surface within the equivalence, within the tight geometry, the rather puritanical geometry of the grid, that gives the American city its character. It's totally different from a European city. Manhattan, in its densest portions, has exactly the same grid as the blocks on which the brownstones are. All that happens, the infrastructure doesn't change, the blocks don't change, it's only the density and the usage that changes. Flying into Los Angeles is one of the most incredible experiences of flying into a grid. And here is a lovely drawing done by Charlie Blessing who's one of our great architectural draftsmen, still alive. Charlie, a wonderful draftsman. This was a drawing that he did on one of our rudettes, the Denver rudette that I served on with him. And this is a drawing of Denver. And it shows the rural grid running into the heart of Denver, into the skyscraper core, with the Platte River meandering and the Rocky Mountains beyond. Now, when we look at Madison and we look at the commercial street, we can see these buildings with precisely the same bay size, very often with exactly the same floor plan, and very often with exactly the same section, but with a surface treatment that varies all the way down the street. Varies because the individual owners vary and because they say different things about themselves. One sees this everywhere. Wherever you look, you will see this richness of surface expressed on the basis of a very tight geometry and equivalence. And nowhere is this more poetically expressed, of course, than in Disneyland, where Walt Disney has recreated Main Street, USA, with its tremendous richness of surface at 2/3 of the full scale, so that it's much closer to us, it's much more tactile than it actually is in our normal commercial streets. But it indicates to us, it teaches us a lesson of that extraordinary richness. And why? Why this richness? Well, it seems to me that one of the things that our main streets do for us in the tradition that we inherit is that in the vastness of this continent, under the endless sky, that huge loneliness that in the 19th century must have separated settlements from one another, we were able to create a surface that was so rich, so intimate, that it gave us an instant sense of place, an instant sense of human scale and of human drama, of human learning, of human literacy in the vastness of the landscape. I find that very poetic and very exciting. And I see it everywhere, this rampant desire to express oneself. I don't know whether those of you who were on the Muncie charrette remember this motorcycle that we discovered. And there it was, with every kind of light. You can imagine what the damn thing looked like coming down the highway at night. I mean, when he put on his brakes. And if you look inside, you'll see some of the lights and lanterns, and he has eagles and medallions and every kind of folderol on it. And the front was just as ornate. I've got all sorts of slides of this wonderful, wonderful artifact. And summarizing this little piece of the lecture, Jim Wines did this marvelous drawing called The High Rise of Suburbia, which is really a high rise of American urbanism. What he's done is to turn the grid into 3 dimensions. That's all he's done. And he's slotted into it our infinite desire to express our difference from our neighbor, to express our personalities and who we are. So he's put into it the ranch houses, the Ryan homes, the mobile homes, the modern homes, the Victorian houses, and all the rest of it, with all of our different plantings, our porches, our steps, our awnings, our bay windows, and all the rest of all of that, all contained within the three-dimensional grid. Well, now, what about urban design then? Who uses urban designers? Well, the people who use urban designers are the people who whose ladders break, who want to change the sign, but the ladder's broken. And they're looking for urban designers to come and help them to repair the ladder, so that they don't look to urban designers to actually do their work for them, to do their project for them. They want urban designers to set them back on track so that they can actually exercise their own democratic and political right to carry out their own schemes. Urban designers almost entirely are people who make recommendations, are people who help communities to establish policy, people who help communities to get over the broken ladder and be able to move on. Now, how do we do this? One of the things that we do is to take to heart what Thomas Jefferson said, because it really is at the essence of local participatory democracy. He said, "I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of society but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion." Wonderful words. I mean, it absolutely is at the key of everything that we should strive to do. We should strive with every fiber of our minds to increase the sense of value, to increase the sense of discretion in the exercise of participatory power, of participatory decision-making that we can. It's the essence of the American way. And it is at the essence of, participatory urban design. I think there's nothing in the world more arrogant than an architect who thinks in this democracy that he can impose upon an unwilling community an aesthetic idea that he's drawn from whatever source, whether within himself or from some European tradition or from other peers of his own, that he can impose it. We have to find the vocabulary. We have to find the metaphor within the city that we're working in, within the society with whom we work. In every city, there is a metaphor of becoming, just as there is in every person. If you ask people, what kind of city, what kind of society do you want your children, shop fronts with all their lintels and their brackets and their eaves and all the rest of it? And we had two portals. We devised two portals, one at each end, so that the street would have a beginning and an end. And once again, it's all done. Muncie Charette, I don't know quite what we're going to say about all this, but we're going to just have a very brief discussion of the Muncie Charette, which we did in 1982. Mr. Parker, Mr. Landry, and I don't know who the third one is. Team 3 proposal. We have to start with that, don't we, Dean? This was the team that Dean and I worked on. You can see we we proposed two anchors, the river being an anchor at one end with a riverfront development, and a marketplace at the other, owing perhaps a little bit to the great signoria in Siena in its fan-shaped form, but really a lovely space at that end with a sort of rather Beaux-Arts type landscape treatment leading into it. Team 5 is a bit of a mess. I don't know who the hell was doing Team 5. And I don't know whose this was. I believe this bridge is still there. Wasn't that a nice idea of turning it into a pedestrian bridge? That was lovely. The view from underneath it, up the river. Housing along the riverfront. And then we had a great big meeting in the Muncie Civic Theatre. Is the theatre still there? It's very nice, that theatre. It's really wonderful. Mayor Wilson. And I guess my time has expired, so that's the end of that. Thank you, everybody.
What we thought we would do for a format would be to have David and Scott Truex, who has rejoined our faculty as a member of the planning department, who put together my spreadsheet. Questions about it. We might talk a little bit about, or you might ask some questions about what did come out of Muncie Charrette 82 or what didn't come out of it. Maybe David can offer some additional insights into where Charrettes work and where they don't work. So with that, I think Scott, if you may just sit up there. And, why don't you fire away or ask some questions?
Yes, sir. Oh, there's no doubt about it at all. I think there are really two. I think there are really two genesises to it. Genesises, a word. There seem to be two mainsprings. The first is a general one, which is that cities like Muncie are in desperate shape. When the city was laid out, it had a single center. Today, Muncie has many centers, just like most metropolitan areas have many centers. The old city has dissolved in its physical form to some remarkable extent. We have to decide what to do about that. The new centers, well, we're in one. The university is a center. Our shopping centers are centers. Downtown Muncie is just another center within a multi-nodal metropolitan area. That isn't to say that the American concept of democracy has declined. The American concept of the self-determination of local areas has certainly not declined. People are as vigorously involved in the issues of suburbia as they are in the issues of downtown. The processes for dealing with suburbia in terms of urban design are essentially no different. I'm talking about the political processes, are essentially no different from the processes of downtown. But downtown nevertheless has the armature of the grid. And we understand the grid very well. It's deep within our souls. We understand it very well. And in our contract, we will work with that. Suburban areas don't have the grid, but they have nevertheless, they have the same attitudes towards property and towards property being an equity and a public interest. And that one works with. The Muncie charrette of 1982 was an earnest attempt to deal with the challenge that has resulted from the multinodal center and the dispersal of that strength of the traditional city. The Main Street of Muncie cannot any longer anticipate that it can fulfill its traditional role. It's not possible. The tradition that it had is gone. It was a single center city, now it's a multinodal city. So what we have to do is to decide what kind of node is it within the multinodal city. We have to establish what the character, what the metaphor of that node is. Gruen tried to do it by imposing on it an intellectual idea, which was the walkway surrounded by a one-way racetrack with parking areas all. It was an intellectual idea. It was an idea that he imposed on several towns, including Evansville. Most intellectual ideas imposed from outside don't work. And you should know that. It's an arrogance to expect them to do so. What one has to do is to unlock the metaphor, unlock the becoming, to find out where, what is there, and what it's trying to be. And then find an urban design language for that. And the way one does that is to work with the people who are concerned with it, with the merchants, with people who shop there, with people who don't shop there, because the people who don't shop there for a reason too. And to establish, if one can, what that place is trying to be. Clearly, it can't be a regional shopping center. There are a variety of reasons for that, which I won't bore you with. Regional shopping centers, for example, are not subdivided into individual property ownerships. Just for a start. Regional shopping centers are not old and historic buildings. For another start. And so it goes on. You have to find an answer within the context of itself. You can't expect it to be something that it's not. So the 82 charrette was very important because it began to grapple with those questions. The great thing that I think the 82 charrette did at the time was it gave Muncie the confidence that it could find answers. It didn't necessarily find the answers, but it displayed that answers could be found if there was courage, determination to do it. And I think that's what the Muncie Charrette 82 did. And that's why I think that now Muncie is looking for professional help to see whether or not we can't get that process on a firm footing and see if we can get something to come out of it.
I think it's an interesting parallel also, the fact that just as UDA comes into town with Ernstberg and Associates and starts in what I think all of us had hoped would be happening within 6 months after Muncie Charrette, but it's taken 5 years to materialize, that we're starting out on another one of the hearts of Muncie in looking at the corridor, 332 corridor, which in December we're going to be holding another charrette, and to identify, as David has pointed out, the metaphors to identify what that corridor is in terms of to the community, in the same way that the Muncie charrette began to ask questions as well as begin to see that we could solve some of the problems, or at least come up with alternatives. The charrette for 332, I think, has that potential, and it will be an interesting parallel as we look at that process as well as the undertaking of the downtown process begins.
Just yell out.
The question is, was Walnut, I believe your question is, was Walnut Street already closed as a pedestrian walkway as a result, or was that the Victor Gruen had already come in and the plaza had been closed, and I don't recall the date. That was about 1976, right?
When it was closed. When it was closed. Uh-huh. The question is, how does one deal with a leadership that lacks vision? It's a very difficult question because, in a sense, the process says that it's not the urban designer and it's not the consultant who's responsible for the result, it's the citizens themselves. That's the essence of the Jeffersonian idea. So that the essence of the idea is to inform the discretion. And the discretion is exercised in that principle by the people themselves. Vision is one of those difficult words because we're not necessarily talking about the flash of lightning vision, the romantic vision that comes to one in a dream, the ride of the Valkyries that suddenly says, the Lord has spoken, and we're going to have ice cream cones all the way up and down the street. It's not necessarily that kind of vision. If you're really talking about the recognition of a metaphor, then I think that is a process of informing the discretion. And I think that is very much the role that urban designers have to assume. We have to, our profession is one of the few generalist professions that are left. We have to be literate. We have to be cultured. We have to go for the ultimate values. We have to stretch those values to their ultimate meanings. And we have to take people with us on that journey. We have to, otherwise we'll fail. And I think that is very much the key. And so a leadership that doesn't necessarily have vision going in doesn't mean to say that it will not come out with vision. If it does come out without vision, then I would say that the urban design process itself has failed, and not necessarily the participants. Well, that may in fact be an answer. There may be a hole to a donut. I mean, nobody's got to say that nobody can say that the downtown has to continue to exist at all. It could be turned into a park, or a lake, or a zoo. I'm not saying that it has to be a downtown, but it's very interesting, this business of the memory. We've just completed a project. It's under construction now, and it will be under construction for a long time. It was 64 acres in the heart of Richmond, Virginia, that had been a low-income, blighted area, certified as blighted in urban renewal days in the 1960s. The population, mostly black, not exclusively, but mostly black, was relocated all over the city. And the 64 acres were cleared by bulldozers. All except for 2 churches. The congregations of the 2 churches, by some extraordinary miracle of alliance and memory, remained intact. People would travel every Sunday from all over the city to come to those churches, and they were packed. And so the churches kept what was called the absentee community alive. In the mid-70s or late 70s, there were several attempts to plan this by the city, plan this area, and put in urban renewal plans. But nothing ever happened for a variety of reasons, most of which was the objection of the absentee community, who came to City Council and said, we don't like your plan. Finally, City Council bowed to the inevitable, and that was to allow the community to choose their own consultants, develop their own plan. Well, the community wasn't there, if you know what I mean. They were just people who came to church. But there was an interview process, and our firm was appointed. And people came from everywhere with their memories. And their memories were burningly real. They could tell us about their grandparents. And they spoke to us standing there up to their knees in weeds, as though the houses were still there. And that's, you know, that's where old Jacob lived down there. And so on. And I remember Emily, you know, when she was a girl. And she lived right across the street. And she had that porch right there. You know, porch. There wasn't anything, they were just weeds. But, you know, it was so burningly real in everybody's mind And we realized that these were all 19th century pattern book houses. And that's what they wanted. They wanted the recreation of the pattern book houses. So we reinvented the pattern book. I think it was the first time in decades that pattern books were reinvented. We reinvented the pattern books. We, with the agreement of the citizens, the patterns were, every time we drew a pattern, they recognized it, said, yeah, that's right, yeah, you know, and so it came out, and then we got the city to agree that they would sell just traditionally exactly the same which the grid was sold. We'd redevise the grid, lay down new streets, new grid, subdivide the grids into lots, and with the sale of every lot was a covenant that you had to build with a basic pattern. And with that pattern were innumerable options that homeowners could clip-on options, you know, with modular options, that you could have this kind of porch or that kind of porch or that kind of porch, this kind of lintel, that kind of dormer, that kind of bracket, that kind of eave, that kind of roof. But the plan, the basic sections, the basic plans, the way they fitted on the lots, were all standard, just as they were in the 19th century. Today, now about 200 of those housing units have been built, and they're going on being built day after day after day. It's a tremendous success. And there was a state, there was a community that that literally had gone away, dispersed. The process brought them back, and with them coming back, they brought their memories and their aspirations. They knew what they wanted. They knew that they wanted their community to have a history, to have a sense of roots, have a sense of place, have a sense of center, to have a sense of the past, and also to have a sense of the future. And maybe that's what we will encounter in Muncie, that there will be, I mean, most communities have this kind of pride. And maybe that, in fact, I'm sure we will encounter it in Muncie. Yeah. Oh, I think that's wonderful. Then you get the richness. That's very good when you get that. There are 2 or 3 ways of dealing with it. If you've got irreversible conflicts, then I think that you just have to resolve that in the ordinary democratic way. But by and large, we've never encountered a collision of 2 aspirations, because generally urban design is so rich that conflicting aspirations can be accommodated. And I can't give you a textbook example of it without digging back into my files, because in the end there is resolution of conflict, and one forgets the conflict, and one goes on to try to build the resolution. But conflicts do occur, and that's very much very important that they should. Conflict is another word for passion. people are passionate about things, and passionate about communities, and passionate about the public interest, and passionate about their values. And sometimes those appear to be in conflict. But as you work and work and work away at it, you can accommodate the differences, and you can arrive at a metaphor that's sufficiently rich to achieve, to resolve those apparent conflicts, and turn them into a rich solution, and then you move forward. I don't know whether that's the kind of answer whether that's an adequate answer to your question, but I really can't give you a test case except that I do remember the incidents. In Pontiac, for example, we had police making arrests in our public meeting. We were pleading with the police not to do it, even though people were fighting. People were standing up and socking one another. We tried to get the police not to intervene, because what we needed to do was to demonstrate to those people that they were not really in conflict, but they were talking about two different things. And they only appeared to be in conflict, and we could accommodate the different things. And I remember those clearly. I remember those fights, and oh, it was awful, really, to experience it, because one felt so terribly deeply and compassionately for the people who felt so strongly about the future of the city and the role of they were racial conflicts and class conflicts and conflicts between people who were union and non-union, that kind of thing. And really, in the end, we resolved it all. We created a thing called the Human Resources Center, a center in which we celebrated all these different resources, human resources, that there were in the city. And we found programs for all of these things, and the conflicts disappeared. So I can't even remember what the issues were that they were fighting on. But I do remember what the resolution is, and it's all built and done and successful. Yes, sir. Right. Well, we may be able to answer that in 4 or 5 months' time. It would be very wrong to sit here before we've even begun and even speculate as to what that might be. But in different places, it takes different forms. For example, we are working at the moment on the stretch, those of you who know Pittsburgh, in the heart of the Golden Triangle is Fifth Avenue. It used to be, many years ago, the upscale shopping part of the region, the upscale. That was where the most expensive shops were. There was a department store at each end, and in between were the upscale shops. It was the kind of area that people would dress up to go shopping. You weren't seen on Fifth Avenue unless you were in your best clothes. Today, it's become the discount center. It's all full of discount houses. And people do their shopping in the big regional malls. Now the question is, what do? You try to revive it as upscale, or the discount houses are very successful. Or what do? Well, our answer is this, and it may not appeal to you, and I'm not trying to import this. Talking to everybody, what do they like about the discount houses? They like the vitality, the quick turnover of goods, the fact that they're inexpensive, the fact that people can go in and make a quick purchase at lunchtime, that among all the office towers and all the rest of it, they don't want the kind of shopping where they have to spend a long time. They only have an hour. They rush in and they rush out. They like the quick burgers. They like the quick exchange. And all we hear, the only metaphor we hear, is the metaphor of market. The metaphor of the market. So what are we going to do? We're going to create a Hong Kong. We're going to reintroduce the city. The city passed a no hanging sign ordinance about 30 years ago. The city is now going to rewrite that ordinance to permit hanging signs in particular areas. This will be a hanging sign area with banners, hanging signs, neon lights, all the rest of it that you can imagine. We're going to make it more so, more of a market. It's trying to be a market. It's struggling. It's like a butterfly struggling to get out of the constricting crystals. That's what will happen. Now that's what I'm saying. Now we've got to look at Muncie and begin to feel what is struggling to come out there.
I could just make three announcements. Number one, as has been mentioned by Scott and by David, there are going to be two very, very intriguing and I think wonderful opportunities for you as students and as Muncie citizens to take part in during the next year here. One is the 332 charrette, which I know will have some public sessions. The other one, of course, is the downtown revitalization plan, which, as David has said, is certainly going to solicit public input. And as students here, you are, for a point in your time, in your careers, you are citizens of Muncie. And so, as David mentioned, the university with 18,000 of you and your colleagues are a major user group of the city of Muncie. And so hopefully you will take part in these input sessions. The third and last thing is I know who the next speaker is going to be on the guest lecture series. I just don't know when. It's going to be Steve Bedaines, the Jersey Devil. John, when is that? November the 2nd. So that will be our next Monday guest lecture. I'm sorry, John. Next Monday there's one. I'm sorry. Gee, Hari told me it was Steve Bedaines. To show you don't believe in a Dutchman. I'm sorry, John. I didn't know that. Okay, but there is one next Monday night. Okay, and then there's one on the 19th. Okay, Carlos Costello, our visiting professor from Argentina, on the 26th. Best thing would be to look for posters, and your studio critics will also make those announcements. Thanks very much, David. Thank you all for coming.